The sun was sinking low over the wide, wind-brushed plains when the words tore from her throat, thin and trembling, yet sharp enough to cut through the murmuring crowd. "Please!" Not in front of them. Her knees shook as she stood between the ranch house and the rail fence, dust clinging to the hem of her faded dress, eyes glistening with a fear she had carried too long to hide anymore. And behind her the children pressed together in a silent knot. 5 small lives holding their breath as if the world itself might shatter with the next heartbeat. The rancher had been mid-step when she spoke, his boots suspended above the hard-packed earth, his hand half raised in that familiar motion of command he used on cattle, men and fate alike. But her plea struck him like a rifle shot, stopping him cold, freezing every line in his weathered face as memory, bitter, sharp, relentless, rose up and wrapped around his chest like barbed wire. For he knew that tone, that terror, and he knew exactly what she was asking him not to do, even if the crowd did not. The men who had ridden in that morning stood in a loose half-circle now, hats low, eyes measuring the worth of fear and land in the same cold way, their horses snorting behind them as if sensing the blood in the air. And the woman, Mara, clutched her hands together so tightly that her knuckles blanched white, her breath fluttering in shallow gasps, while the eldest child tugged at the back of her dress, whispering a wordless question that cut deeper than any accusation. And it was in that moment, suspended between what had been and what was about to be done, that the rancher froze, not out of fear for himself, but because the past he had buried, under years of dust and work, had suddenly clawed its way back into daylight. 17 years earlier, he had stood in almost the same place, younger, angrier, still believing that strength meant never bending, and another woman with eyes just as desperate had stood before him while he looked the other way, because looking cost him something he did not yet know how to give, and the sound of her crying had followed him for years in the silence of the plains, in the long nights when the cattle were restless and the wind whispered through dry grass, like accusing voices. Now the echo had returned, not as a memory but as a living, shaking human being pleading for dignity in front of her children, and the crowd shifted uneasily as they sensed the change in him, this sudden stillness that replaced his usual iron certainty. And someone laughed nervously, another spat into the dirt. Yet none of them dared speak because there was something in the way he stood, rigid, breath held, eyes fixed on her, that warned them this moment was no longer simple. Mara lifted her head just enough to meet his gaze, and in her eyes he saw not guilt, not defiance, but a roar, breaking hope that he might choose differently than men always had before. And the choice weighed heavier than any drought or debt he had ever faced, because this time the price was not land or money, but who he would be when this was over. The men had come to claim what the law said was theirs, her land for unpaid, taxes left behind by a husband buried 2 winters ago, his grave just beyond the cottonwood trees, and they expected the rancher to stand aside as a neutral neighbor, a man who did not interfere in matters of paperwork and power. But the children's eyes behind her shattered that expectation like glass, each small face reflecting the same fragile question, will anyone stand for us? And when the rancher finally moved his foot and set it down, the sound of leather on dirt seemed to echo across the entire valley, a quiet thunder that made every man stiffen, and he exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath held for 17 years, and said in a voice low and steady, "You will leave," that not shouted, not pleaded, but spoken with the finality of a man who has already accepted whatever comes next. The crowd erupted in murmurs, disbelief rippling outward as the riders exchanged sharp glances, one of them stepping forward with a bitter grin to remind him of papers and laws and consequences. But the rancher did not look at him. He looked only at Mara and then at the children behind her. And the set of his jaw said more than any threat ever could. Dust swirled in the slanting sunlight as the wind rose, carrying with it the weight of decision, and for a long heartbeat the world seemed to hang suspended between violence and mercy. And then the first rider reached for his reins, uncertainty creeping into the hard lines of his posture. because something old and unmovable had awakened in the man before him, something that would not be pushed aside by ink or intimidation. And as the standoff held, Mara's breath broke into a quiet sob she could no longer contain, not of fear now, but of the unbearable relief of not standing alone anymore. What none of them yet knew was that this single frozen step, this one choice made in the dust of an ordinary afternoon, would unravel secrets buried for nearly 2 decades, would set fire to old loyalties and older grudges, would test the ranches, past as brutally as it would shape the future of every soul on that land. And as the sun finally dipped behind the hills and shadows stretched long and uncertain across the yard, one truth became unavoidable. Nothing would ever return to the way it had been before she spoke those trembling words. And if this moment already has your heart racing and your soul leaning forward to see what happens next, make sure you subscribe to the channel now, because the rest of this story will take you through sacrifice, redemption, and a showdown that will stay with you long after the final word.